Take a second and ask yourself, who are you, really? No, seriously. If you had to completely strip away your job title, your role in your family, or even just your physical appearance, what exactly is left? It's kind of the most profound question we can ask as humans, right? And honestly, before we can even begin to understand how we interact with the rest of the world, we really have to look inward and ponder our own true identity.
Welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through a pretty fascinating journey into the human mind today. We are focusing on Psychology Chapter 2, Self and Personality. And hey, you might notice we're using a super clean, modern notebook layout for our visuals today instead of those clunky old arrow diagrams. We want to keep things simple and well-organized so we can easily strip away the noise and focus entirely on how our internal identities meet the external world.
All right, here's our agenda for today. We're going to start by defining the self, then look at cultural views of identity, ask what is personality, dive into psychodynamic theories, and finally wrap up with the Big Five model. Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, defining the self, the internal experience. So, the self is formally defined as the totality of an individual's conscious experiences, ideas, thoughts, and feelings with regard to themselves. It's not just one fleeting thought, It's literally the entire library of everything that makes up your conscious existence. It encompasses every single idea you hold about your own skills, all your memories, and that ongoing narrative you constantly tell yourself about who you actually are. Now, what's really fascinating here is how the self actually splits into two distinct experiences. Think of it kind of like the actor versus the consequence. On one hand, the self acts as the subject. This is the active you, right? The actor who does things and actively engages in the process of knowing. But on the other hand, the self is also the object. That's the consequence that gets affected, observed, and known by you. So wild as it sounds, you are simultaneously the one experiencing the world and the one observing yourself experiencing it. Building on that idea, our self-concept generally branches off into two main directions. First, we've got the personal self, which heavily emphasizes personal freedom, individual achievement, and your own comforts. But conversely, we have the social or relational self. This one emerges entirely in relation to other people, emphasizing cooperation, family unity, affiliation, and even sacrifice. Just consider this for a second. When you think about who you are, is your self-concept driven more by your own solitary personal achievements, or is it rooted in the deep relationships and family bonds you've built? Moving right along to Section 2, Cultural Views of Identity, East versus West. This comparison brilliantly illustrates the stark cultural contrasts in how identity is formed. In Indian collectivistic cultures, the boundary between the individual self and the social self is actually shifting and fluid. There aren't these rigid, clear dichotomies. Instead, the individual and the group exist in a state of harmonious coexistence. But contrast that with Western individualistic cultures, where boundaries are relatively fixed. There you'll find very clear dichotomies between the self and others, meaning the individual and the group remain entirely distinct entities. All right, Section 3, what is personality? The external expression. So here's a crucial, kind of fun fact. The word personality literally derives from the Latin word persona, which actually meant a mask used by actors in Roman theater. They'd use these masks to change their facial makeup to perform specific roles. Today, of course, when we talk about psychological personality, we don't mean a superficial physical appearance. Rather, it refers to a stable set of traits, sort of like a psychological mask that we present consistently across different situations over time. To really ground this concept, let's look at a foundational quote from Gordon Allport. He said, "Personality is the dynamic organization within the individual of those psychological systems that determine his unique adjustments to his environment." Notice those words, dynamic organization. Personality is absolutely not a static object. It's a highly active, adaptive psychological system that's constantly helping us adjust to the world around us. When psychologists actually try to study these masks, they generally use one of two approaches. The type approach examines broad patterns in behavioral characteristics, like, saying someone is a type A personality because they're highly motivated, always in a hurry, and burdened with work. In contrast, the trait approach zooms way in on specific individual psychological attributes along which people vary. So instead of just dumping you into a broad bucket, it measures exactly how much of a certain characteristic you actually possess. Next up is Section 4, Psychodynamic Personality Theories, Deep Dives. We have to start with Sigmund Freud's famous structural model of personality. Freud theorized this kind of trifecta constantly at work in our minds.
First up is the id, which is deeply instinctual, very demanding, and works purely on the pleasure principle. Then, way on the other side, we have the superego, acting as the strict moral branch of our personality. And caught right in the middle is the ego. The ego is basically the rational manager, working on the reality principle. It's constantly trying to mediate, satisfying the primal demands of the id while still adhering to the strict moral guidelines of the superego. Now, while Freud certainly laid the groundwork, subsequent thinkers, known as post-Freudians, took things in quite a different direction. They shifted away from Freud's heavy emphasis on those darker sexual and aggressive instincts. Instead, they really expanded on the concept of the ego, focusing far more on a positive, problem-solving view of human development. They emphasized our capacity for creativity, our competence, and our striving toward higher human aspirations. We can neatly summarize these post-Freudian thinkers right here in our notebook layout. Carl Jung developed analytical psychology, introducing the super fascinating idea of a collective unconscious filled with universal archetypes. Then Karen Horney brought a lens of optimism, arguing that it's disturbed interpersonal relationships in childhood rather than sheer biology that drive psychological issues. Alfred Adler focused on lifestyle and social interests, famously giving us the concept of the inferiority complex and exploring how we strive for goals. And finally, Erik Erikson highlighted psychosocial development, emphasizing the rational, conscious ego and that crucial identity crisis we all face during adolescence. And that brings us to Section 5, the Big Five Model, OCEAN. We're going to go letter by letter through the OCEAN acronym, starting with E for extroversion. Individuals high in extroversion are sociable, outgoing, and they're actively energized by social interactions. Honestly, they're often big risk takers too. On the low end, introverts prefer quiet time alone and absolutely need those solitary moments to recharge their batteries. So ask yourself, are you usually the life of the party, or do you prefer to recharge in quiet solitude? Next up is A for agreeableness. This trait basically measures our social harmony. People high in agreeableness are compassionate, cooperative, and empathetic. They frequently prioritize relationships and the needs of others above their own. Conversely, folks low in agreeableness tend to lean into competitive confrontation. They might appear more argumentative and are totally willing to challenge others, even at the expense of harmony. Then we have C for conscientiousness. Highly conscientious people are the planners and organizers of the world. They're orderly, highly dependable, and possess a deeply disciplined work ethic, which, by the way, often directly correlates to academic and professional success. On the flip side, those on the lower end of the spectrum might appear disorganized, careless, or just highly impulsive with their time and resources. The next letter is N for neuroticism. In psychology, this essentially refers to an individual's baseline emotional stability. People high in neuroticism are more prone to anxiety, worry, and sadness, and they often experience difficulty regulating their emotions. Those who score low, however, are generally emotionally stable. They calmly process stress and tend to handle life's inevitable setbacks with relative ease. Wrapping up the Big Five, we have O for openness to experience. Highly open individuals are your imaginative thrill seekers. They are curious, very unconventional, and always eager to try new things. We contrast this with those who score low. Individuals who find a deep sense of comfort in tradition, are somewhat resistant to sudden change, and generally just feel uncomfortable with high levels of uncertainty. I want to leave you with one final thought to process. Today, we've defined the internal self, explored how culture shifts our boundaries, and unpacked the specific traits that make up our external persona. So, considering your specific Big Five traits and your unique cultural background, what mask are you wearing right now? And more importantly, what does that mask reveal about your true self? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep seeking, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.